Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is the live Q&A show for everything Microsoft 365. So this can be either Power Platform, modern SharePoint, Microsoft Teams, whatever the situation may be. Welcome your questions. If you have any questions, just go ahead and leave them in the chat. We may have a guest joining us in this session. We'll see. This is one of he actually has a YouTube channel as well, one that I follow pretty frequently, and he does some very, very interesting things. So that's going to be kind of new for this format. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is not only invite other people that I admire their work because I think they go, I can tell the practitioners, and we all can, right? You can tell by watching someone or speaking to someone on if they actually use the tools or the technology, or if they're just reading up and learning something and just shooting a video or regurgitating something that they learned. So it's very easy to determine that based on the quality of the training. So one of the things that I would love to do is to get invite different people from the community to join us here on a Saturday and be respectful of everyone's time. So we will have Paulie. I can see Paulie has joined. I will bring him on the stage here in a second. The other announcement I would like to make is some of the new technologies that are coming up. So one of the things, and we'll get to a demo here later, is the ability to view Visio in the browser, which is really cool. The other capability would be able to Windows 365 is coming. So when all of my demos are actually using a virtual machine on Azure, and I'm really excited to see one, the performance enhancements that Windows 365 may bring to the table. A lot of speculation is that it's just a rebranding of what they already have in Azure. And I'm hoping that's not the case, but we shall see. And then also I'm very interested in the price point. So that's going to be released on August 2nd of this upcoming week. So we're definitely be on the lookout for that. And I also have some questions that I received using the form. So I will actually drop the link in the form in the chat. So that way, if you have any questions, solution ideas, or anything along those lines, feel free to fill out the Microsoft form and fill that out. But yeah, super excited for there. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to introduce Paulie. Just go ahead and add him. Hey, Paulie, how are you?
Yeah, I'm really good. How are you?
Good, man. Good, good. Great
Nice
to
to meet you.
actually speak with you live and direct. I think, like I said, I'm a huge fan of your YouTube channel. I think you definitely take it a level deep. So super excited to have you on. So how are things for you with you?
Yeah, good. It's I enjoy doing that Power Automate stuff, trying to get to the next level of solving those little things that seem like they should be doable, but for some reason you can't get it done, So they're good fun.
Exactly. How long have you been working with Power Automate or Power Platform in general?
Not that long, actually. I mean, I flirted with it a few times over the years, and then probably about a year ago, I started to get quite into Power Automate, and then a few months after that, I became one of the Power Automate super users. I picked Power Automate up quite quickly, and then in like the past 6 months, I've been doing more Power Apps as well, and getting more into Dataverse as a data source, and really pushing solutions out to my customers on that Power Apps Dataverse platform with the Power Automates in the background, taking care of business where they need to.
That's interesting. I mean, looking at your videos, I mean, for you to go as deep as you go and figure out, like for example, I mean, the adding images to a Word file using a standard connector versus a premium connector, that was not obvious. Like I saw your solution and I was like, dude, like how did you figure this out? For you to be in this game for only a year and have that level of depth is very impressive. So, I mean, what is your background like? Are you from a development background or?
So I've done quite a bit of development over the years in all kinds of different languages. I mean, my background is really in ERP systems, but legacy, older generation ERP systems. So I do a lot of Unix and Linux, and that, funnily enough, is actually what brought me to Power Platform, because I wanted to be able to give some of those old systems new functionality. And just by sending a HTTP request off into Power Automate, I could take data from those environments and put them straight in, and it would only be very easy from the old systems point of view. Just one command, send some data, and then Power Platform takes over from there. So for me, it's actually quite exciting, because when I show that to customers, they're like really shocked at, they've got this system which is maybe 15 or 20 years old still, and it's doing things that have only come out, in the last 6 months.
Wow.
So for them, it's quite exciting. So
That is pretty exciting.
but I mean, with the Word thing, I've been working on that for a while. I mean, I know that I already knew that all Office documents are zip files. So I've known that for years. And I dived into that solution months ago, and I had it in my head that you could already zip files in Power Automate. So I didn't even worry about that. But I built the solution, and then got to that part and thought, oh no, there's no way to zip. And there are ways with third-party connectors, but a lot of people, a lot of the time, they don't want to use the third-party connectors. So I thought, okay, it's not really a solution until I can get the zip. And then it was when I was messing around in SharePoint and I saw that I could just download a zip. I thought, okay, I wonder if we can hook into that. And actually that led me on to discover a whole bunch of other stuff, because that API I used, that render list as data stream, that can do a bunch more stuff that is actually quite difficult in Power Automate, or not even possible. So for example, I forgot what my example. Oh yeah, getting totals and things like that, getting totals and grouping values by, if you wanted to get a total for an entire list or a total for a customer or a supplier and group it. It's not a complicated flow, but it is
Right.
quite a time-consuming flow, and it needs a bit of work. Whereas you can do that in one API call just with SharePoint using that method.
Now, what is the API call? You said stream a list, like a data stream of a list?
Yeah, so that zip solution calls, and I found that, by the way, let me just go back a step. I wanted to get that zip solution, so all I did was go into my browser and open up the development tools, and then cleared my log, pressed I want zip, and then stopped the log straight afterwards, so I could see exactly the steps it took. And then I could see this API that was being called to render that list. And so, when we do send an action to SharePoint, HTTP action, we might use the, get by title, get list by title action, or something along those lines.
Right.
But there is another one that when you're in the browser, that is using all the time, and that is this render list as data stream. When you look on the Microsoft documentation of that, it's got all kinds of different options which you can use to bring out different types of information about the items on that list. And that list can be a custom list or a document library.
Okay.
And you can do a lot of good stuff with that. So trying to get that zip solution led me to find a few more things which I didn't expect to find. So when you dig around a little bit, you can find some interesting stuff. And that you can still use the send a HTTP request to SharePoint action, even though you're calling, I guess, what isn't, an API that they shout about necessarily. It's difficult to find, but it's right there in plain sight also.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that was my other question. Like, if it's like an undocumented or unpublished API, my first knee-jerk reaction would be, it could be something that could potentially go away, right?
Yeah.
They can change the signature, they can do away with it, in general, just because they don't assume developers are actually using it as something that's like internal reference only.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. These things that I've used are integral to SharePoint, so I think the chances of that are not great. And that particular render list as data stream, it's there. It's all documented. It's just that I wasn't aware of it really, And it
Gotcha.
seems like not that many people were. Otherwise, would have had these solutions a long time ago. The zip one,
Exactly.
the zip one that could change because that is just it's actually I think an Azure API, and
Okay.
that is the one. It's the same API. When you see a document in SharePoint and you get a thumbnail, um, that is that same endpoint generating those thumbnails as it's generating the zips. And when you do a document conversion in Power Automate, you might convert from Word to PDF. That's the same endpoint doing all
I
of that
saw
work.
that. Yeah, I saw your video, and I couldn't remember who came up with that. Was it you or Reza? But I saw your video, and you referenced Reza's video on that whole PDF. And that's the thing, man. I mean, watching your video, and I consume a lot of video, more than I produce. And I love consuming video, especially people of your caliber, because one, it just gives you different ideas on how to approach a problem. And then two, you find these golden nuggets that it's just like on the surface, you just didn't think of. So where I sit, I'm not like a hardcore developer, though I have a developer background. So I started like on the help desk and junior developer and senior developer, then architect and the solution architect. And my pride is the solution architect, listening to the requirement, understanding the tool set. And that's the thing, you can only architect as good as you understand the tooling and the possibilities. And I think with solution architecting, it's not something that you can read, it's not something you can train, it's experience. It's like purely experience. Because I think the more scenarios you've been through and the more use cases you've seen and actually worked through, the stronger you are.
Yeah.
And one of the things and I think that's one of the things that keep me from like going to like a technical director or a manager is because I love coding. And I think one of the value adds that I have, and I sense that you have this as well, I know you do, just from your level of detail in your technical app, is the ability to code, right? Because if you're a solution architect and you can still develop, that just makes you that much stronger in any scenario, even when you have a dev team, because now you can mentor the developers versus taking what they say and then it's like, well, this is not possible. And then you're just like, okay, let's find something else. Whereas if you're a developer, you understand the tooling that they're dealing with and the techniques and strategies. And that's why I love your videos because, man, it's like you're thinking outside of the box. And usually with these toolings and solutions, that's what you need to do. You have to be able to think outside of the box and make some really cool things.
Sometimes actually those, I don't want to call it restrictions, but the Power Platform environment is you are maybe a slightly more penned in than you would be in a traditional environment, and sometimes those restrictions can actually lead you to be more creative. Because when you've got those, when you're sort of in that, I don't know what the right word is, but you know what I mean. When you're in this kind of bubble of what you can and can't do,
Exactly.
that can lead you to come up with some quite cool ways of getting around building solutions that you would imagine in a different way in a traditional environment. You do have to kind of have a bit of an imagination shift when you're thinking about building stuff in Power Platform. But once you're
Absolutely.
in that mindset, it's fine. You quickly imagine things in a way that makes sense for that platform.
Right.
But I do exactly what you were just talking about. I work with a Power Apps developer, and sometimes I just build a little proof of concept and say, well, this is what I want, but can you flesh it out a bit more for me and, make it into a working thing? But if there's a bit that's a bit tricky, I might build it first and
Right.
then just say, this is how we're going to do it. And it's that PDF thing, the PDFing thing was actually part of that. That was really an experiment for us to be able to build an app that is like that, just much more sophisticated. And that
Gotcha.
worked out really well.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Oh, this is awesome. So, Diversity Love is in the house. And there's a question that came in. can you explain memory management and CDS or Dataverse, which I think they're synonyms now? Can you delete or archive records automatically so it does not fill up? Now, this is very interesting. Me personally, I haven't dug that deep inside the Dataverse as a data repository. I use it just because of the licensing and the costs, right? And the storage limitations, well, they're very stringent on the storage, on what you get. And I just feel with SharePoint lists and SharePoint libraries, like even the SharePoint library within the site collection, you get 25 terabytes. And that's just like from a Dataverse, I mean, that can cost you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars per month, if even, flirting with terabyte storage in general. So what's been your experience with Dataverse? Like, have you had to do that storage management to make sure you stay within a certain storage quota because you're really monitoring the cost of your solution?
Well, I haven't yet, but I will before long, because I'm not actually using Dataverse, the paid for version. I'm only using Dataverse for Teams. And that's got the 2 gigabyte, I think 2 gigabyte and 1 million record limit. I think it could be 4 gigabyte. I think it's 2. And when the time comes when that's nearing its million records, which will probably take, I would guess, about a year, I'll just have flows running, which just filter out the old records and delete them automatically. And they'll run every night. Now, in the application I've built, that's fine, because by the time that data is getting that old, it's not going to be a problem. But other applications, you'd have to keep the data. So you're right. In SharePoint, you could just keep that data indefinitely. So I guess what you could do is pull those records out. Find some records with flow and pull them out to a different source, and know CSV or SharePoint or whatever you wanted to do. But you're going to hit this price point at some point where if you need to keep the records, you're going to have to go to the paid version, and it might cost a lot of money.
And I think that's the day and age we're in now, right? Because if you can do things efficiently, especially when you're in an Azure meter situation, or if you can get very creative and say, yes, Microsoft is driving me down this Dataverse tunnel, which has a balloon payment at the end, depending on your solution. Now, how you build and how creative you are and how efficient your code is equates to real dollars now, right? And I think that's the thing. So that's even additional pressure, to your point, to be creative on, okay, I'm gonna do this for now. I understand what my storage limits are, and then I don't have to worry about it now, but at least I need a roadmap. So once I get to that, and I love your archive it in SharePoint, because now you keep the data, and you kind of get to, I don't want to say warm storage or whatever, but it's not premium data. And I think that's the difference between the two. Data versus premium storage, where SharePoint is, I mean, it's just so wide and so long, and it performs, right? And I think that's the biggest debate, because I speak to other colleagues and other architects who are in this space. It's like, okay, justify why you would go Dataverse versus SharePoint outside of, especially on the Power Platform for Teams. They drive you down that, right? It's just like, as soon as you spin it up, okay, this is where you are, and unless you have that mindset, it's like, I don't really need this, or the security requirement that says only those folks within this team, those are only the ones I need to have access to this. But I think under the hood, I mean, it has a significant footprint. I mean, it creates its own environment, and you have these databases, and even from an IT perspective, now you're scrambling, trying to figure out, how do I wrap my hands around everything that's happening in this tenant, where now I have solutions in their own environment, and most of my COE or whatever is probably just configured for the default environment. So it can spiral out of control quickly.
Yeah, I think Teams in general is something that can spiral out of control quickly, without the right policies in place. But I don't think there's really an easy answer to that storage problem. I mean, you can manage it with flows, with OData queries and what do they call it? XML. I forget the term now. There's the queries that you build with XRM Toolbox to
Okay.
filter the data, and then you just bring that out and put it somewhere else. If that's an option, which it might not be depending on the application.
Right.
But that is, in fact, that question goes back to that video you were talking about with the PDF solution. I made that because we were building an app in Dataverse for Teams. We needed to store the PDF document. That was to work around storing it in Dataverse because those PDFs need to be stored. I could have attached them in Dataverse, but had I done that, that Dataverse database would have got to 2 gigabytes so quickly. But instead, all I did was store the SharePoint ID, the ID of the item where the document was stored, and then we just retrieve it from SharePoint. So it's a mixed Dataverse and SharePoint solution. Dataverse holds the metadata. SharePoint's got the PDF document. And so that was just to save on storage space. If it wasn't for that, I'd have just put it in Dataverse.
Now, which SharePoint did you use for those PDFs? Did you just use the one that was attached to Teams?
Yeah.
I love that, right? Because now you have your security remains intact. Because whoever have access to that SharePoint attached to the team have to be a member of that team, so anyone outside of that won't stumble across it if they're doing search or anything like that.
Yeah. Was the person that asked the question specifically related to Dataverse or CDS in general, or is it Dataverse for Teams?
It seems like CDS Dataverse in general. Yep. And diversity, love, if there was any other clarifying or follow-up questions to that, that would be great. Oh, okay, here's another one. Power Automate does it automatically use Dataverse? Or does the Form Pro or Customer Voice automatically take Dataverse? Awesome PDF solution. Would like to see it. Yeah. So I think I can drop your YouTube video. So can you see the chat, Paulie?
No.
No, you can't see the chat. Okay. Yeah. So I'll find your YouTube video link and then drop it in there. I think you can chat me though. I think there's a private chat. So if you drop it in the private chat, I can drop it in the community chat. But I'm trying to add some understanding on the question. So there's a follow-up question that says, Power Automate does it automatically. Does Power Automate automatically use Dataverse? Now, when it comes to Power Automate, that's tricky, right? Because you have to make sure you're in the right environment when you build that solution. So that's one. And does Forms Pro, which is one I'm not familiar with. I haven't had a chance to play with Forms Pro, or Customer Voice automatically take Dataverse? I'm not 100% on Customer Voice. Any context on that one, Paulie?
I think if I understand the question properly, I think Forms Pro, the database where the form submissions sit is a Dataverse database, is a Dataverse. I don't know that you can access it like a Dataverse table, so I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that's where it goes. My experience with forms is I deal with them in Power Automate and put the data where I like. But as I understand it, they do get stored somewhere, and I think that it is a Dataverse database. But don't quote me on it because I'm not 100% sure.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, Microsoft they give us these templates, right, and they give us these starter solutions, and majority of them are going to drive you down that Dataverse, and that's different than Power Apps for Teams and the Teams Dataverse, because now you're on a subscription. I think I'm not sure if it's like a trial or how long they allow you to store that data, but it could be a nasty situation where you try it out and then you actually start using it, and then you start to realize that now you have to pay to continue to use it.
Do you know, it is a shame because I always say this and I always want to shut my own mouth, but it's the only development environment I've ever heard of where the charging is based upon the data source. So it's very rare to have a development environment where the charge is based on what database you connect to. And so I've got somebody I work with who used to be my old boss where I used to work, and he got really excited about doing something. And he's in a big company. His company's got, 2,000 odd people in it. he was really excited about putting something together quite quickly. And I said, yeah, it's possible, but how many people are going to want to access it? And he gave me the numbers, and we quickly did some calculations, and he just said, whoa, there's no way. This is just impossible. It's going to cost us like thousands per month to run it. And it was a small app.
Yep.
And so that, I think, is a stumbling block, because when you're starting out, your app might not represent the value of the cost. And so that stops you before you've even begun. But if you had 50 apps and they were, making the company much more efficient, and it was part of everyone's working day, then maybe the license cost wouldn't be a big deal, because you'd already be earning that back. And so I do think the licensing still could do with tweaking.
And
I
some
think it's
of
just
that,
been halved the cost, doesn't it?
yeah, it can. It can cost you an arm and a leg. I mean, and I even seen it on the Azure side too, right? Like building Azure functions or web jobs or things along those lines, and just not understanding the licensing plan, the right pricing plan for whatever you're trying to build. And in some of these scenarios, because when you go through the tutorial for Power Platform, or if you start off with one of their starter kits, they automatically drive you down that Dataverse tunnel. And you don't necessarily have to go there. Like I would say 95% of the solutions I built are all SharePoint. And there's we don't run into any concerns. And I love it, and I feel more confident, and I can sleep at night, because I know that depending on how they scale, they're going to be covered with their standard licensing. There's no balloon price that's waiting for you at the end of the rainbow, right? So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. It's just being aware of what's available, and to your point, what are standard storage or data source options versus premium? Because some will gravitate towards SQL because that's what they know, versus a SharePoint list, right? Now, one of the biggest not really drawbacks, but usually the biggest counter response to, okay, well, how come you just can't use a SharePoint list or a document library? And it usually falls into security. Like, okay, I only want this person to view the requests that they're submitting. I don't want them to view everything else. Or it can be role-based, meaning that I want my admins to be able to do X, Y, Z, or maybe access out of 20 columns. Admins can access all 20, but my standard user, and these are roles they're creating within their solution, I only want them to access, these 10 or these 10 of the 20. And that becomes an issue, right? Because if they find the SharePoint list, like you can mask it, right? You can, from an end user, you can build a solution to where they have no idea what the back end data source is. But if they find it, then you have to play some tricks on, okay, you have to build on the worst case scenario. What if they did find it? So I came up with a couple of techniques and with this. So let me do this. Let me share my screen real quick. And I would love for you. How much time do you have, Paulie? I don't want to keep you here for the whole.
No, you keep me for as long or as short as you like.
Okay. All right. So here is. Let me do a full screen share here. This is. I'm trying to. I thought I was prepared, but now I'm realizing I'm not. So let me do this. So let me fire up the whiteboard. So usually when it comes to SharePoint versus Dataverse, the security question usually pops up. So one thing to keep in mind, and Polly, I know you know this, I'm just level setting for everyone else who's on the call, is that your form is separate from your data source, right? So here you have a data source that's going to, once you grab the information on this form, it's going to store it somewhere. And what we're saying is that you can use SharePoint as a data source, and I'm drawing it as a database, but really it can be SharePoint lists or libraries. Use that. That's most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, this is going to be covered within the standard licensing that you already have. Or you can do premium data source, which is going to be like Dataverse. And what we're saying is that Microsoft drives you here, because if there is a cost or marketing strategy or sales strategy to increase revenue, this is what they're deploying. They said use this, and they highlight some of the key things that makes this superior than this. Most of the scenarios you can get away with just a SharePoint list. Now let's talk about some of the issues that we have with security. In a SharePoint list, most of the time when you create a form, you want to prevent the user from seeing everyone's items. So everything in green, the current user created, everything in blue was created by someone else using the app. So usually what you want to do is hide these items from the current user, right? Only limit them to the green. So there's a setting that's called item level security that would do this automatically. It would be security trim. There's nothing additional you have to do in your Power App. There's no additional logic you have to do in your Power App. You just have to flip these switches, and I'll show you where those switches are here in a second. Now, the cool thing about these switches is that once you enable them, you're going to have scenarios where you have an admin role, right? So let's just say here in purple, this is my admin user. My admin user needs to be able to see everything, right? So there is a certain permission level in SharePoint to where you can open that up. And even though these are item level restrictions, so that's one. The other scenario is going to be, let me just draw this here. I'm still going to SharePoint, right? So this is still my SharePoint data source. And now what I have a solution that requires 20 columns, right? And you may have like pricing, or you may have some other confidential information that you don't want the end user to see, but you still want the end user to fill out this form. So in those scenarios, what we tend to do is create a subset of that master column list or master list, and create a subset that only has the user-friendly columns available to them. So what we're going to do on this form, we're going to have them populate this list, and then using a Power Automate, have that automatically update the respective columns in this list. And then when I talk to my admins, the ones who actually need to be able to see everything that was submitted, I'm making this list available to the admins, whereas this list here is only available to my end users. And usually that's how I do my segmentation of columns. Paulie, what do you think about that?
Well, I think about one of the things I think about in terms of the pricing is, I don't know if you've used SQL on Azure, but SQL on Azure is actually really good value. You can get quite a high capacity database for quite a low monthly cost, and SQL's got row level security built into it, so that's a big feature. The other big thing that you won't get from SharePoint is referential integrity. So if you delete a sales order, then all the sales order lines will vanish. So you can ensure that the data is always in shape, whereas SharePoint won't give you that kind of functionality. I think SharePoint is great for normalized data and applications that are where the data can sit nicely into a table or two. Do you know what I mean? If that application is going to require writing data to 15 different tables, then it's going to start to get tough in SharePoint. And most of the time, applications don't. I mean, I just released one for a customer a couple of months ago that's a timesheet application, and that uses exactly the method you were talking about. It uses item level security in SharePoint. That's absolutely fine. All the data is almost all in one table. People submit their timesheet data. If they get to the SharePoint table, they'll only see their own data. And it's simple. It requires very little configuration. It's free. They're never going to get close to the amount of records where it's going to cause a problem anyway. So, it's there are advantages and disadvantages to both approaches, and the advantage that most people want is the cost advantage. So it's that I have seen, and it seems like people will go to a lot of lengths to ensure they can get a free solution.
So, so you mentioned Azure SQL, and I think that's very interesting. I haven't had a chance to play around with it, but I think that's definitely a tool to have in the toolbox, especially if the storage requirements are going to be, uh, more cost effective than Dataverse. When you're interacting with an Azure SQL from a Power Apps perspective, or even from a Power Platform, two questions come to mind. One, you're going to pay for the storage in Azure, right?
Yeah,
SQL. Do those require premium connectors for a Power Apps and Power Automate perspective?
they do,
Yeah,
which is, you know, that's the tough part. That, I mean, I built stuff in SQL, but it's always been where the customer already had their data in SQL already. So that was where all the valuable data sat. So if you want to get to that, and that could be SQL on premise or SQL on Azure, it's still premium. SQL on Azure does have some advantages over SQL on premise. So, for example, you can have additional triggers. So when a new row is inserted, start a flow, I don't think you can do that on the on-prem version, but you can still interact with it in quite a rich way. But yeah, premium licenses. But the data limits on SQL on Azure are huge. I think you can get 250 gig database for like $100 a month or something. Although the performance isn't mind blowing, but £200 a month you would get $200 a month you get something quite performant. But then
gotcha.
you're immediately into the spending money territory, which a lot of people don't want to be into.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, and especially if it's not architected correctly, right? Because usually from a budget spend, $200 for most organizations, even if you're small or medium, it's probably not that bad. But they want assurance to say, I don't want to spend this for every solution, right? If you're
Yeah,
architecting this in a way that says, okay, here's our enterprise architecture, and for things that should be Azure SQL or things that would require premium connectors, this is how they're designed, and it scales, meaning that it's not $200 per solution, but this is our baseline on how we're going to operate. That would be one. The other thing too, though, is when it comes to premium connectors, I'm not too concerned. Like, I don't shy away. Like, I don't break my arm to avoid them at all costs, because I still think that if you design it a way, you can design a solution that uses a premium connector, still have 1,000 users that use your application, and not pay 1,000 times the premium connector license,
yeah.
right? You're just designing everything in the context of a service account. So everything that happens in this layer, you're just going to do a proxy via the service account, license that account, and that's the one that takes on your premium workload.
One of the things that I only started to appreciate recently was because of the nature of Power Platform, it's getting picked up by people that aren't necessarily used to developing solutions, but they've hooked onto it and now they're beginning to. And when they're in large organizations, they can't get the IT buy-in to get the premium licensing. And then, I was helping somebody out recently and I said, well, look, it's only going to cost X to do that. And they said, well, look, I just can't, I can't get that. So forget that. It's just impossible.
Gotcha.
And I guess that, because I'm used to dealing with small to medium-sized businesses, 50 to 250 odd people, where you can hook up with someone pretty quickly that will give you what you need. And you can at least have a discussion about it. Whereas if you've got 15,000 people and you're just trying to build something for your little department, sometimes that isn't as easy as you would think.
Exactly. That makes sense. That makes sense. Awesome. Awesome. Well, let's do this. I do have a question from Mohammed. He's asking, I'm trying to get a second list date column value into a Power App that's bind to the first list date card column. How would you achieve that? So, if I understand correctly, what we're trying to do, and Muhammad is pretty active on the channel as well. He's very engaged and I don't know. Muhammad, I haven't had a chance to speak with him directly, but I interact with him a lot in the comments section. So I have a sense of where he's at in his journey a little bit, just based on the questions that were asked. So let me do this. Let me fire up this Power Ideas. And when I'm thinking, and we run into this a lot, right? So you have data in one data source, and you have your main form component tied to another data source, and now you need to manipulate data for whatever reason, right? And there are going to be many scenarios. So let me see if I can build this really quickly from here. So if I go to, let's see, site content, and I'm gonna just, let me see if I have anything I can leverage. No, not really. So let me just create 2 new lists here. So I am having the list here. Let me just call this, well, let me do this, sorry. Let's just do this list, and let's just call this the issue tracker. That usually comes with a bunch of columns that we can play with. It definitely has date columns in there. And then I'm gonna create another list, and let's just call this and say deployment or something like that. So with this deployment list, I'm gonna create another date column, and let's just call this start date. And let's just add a few items here. So let's just call this iteration 1, and then the start date on that is going to be every month, right? So now what we have that issues list, and we want the start date to be hydrated by this deployment list. Iteration 2. All right. And of course, these dates can be whatever. So now if I have a Power App, let me, I can leverage this. So I'll just bring this in. So we just bring this one, and then go to my list, and then I have my issue tracker DC. Go ahead and bring that in as a data source, and then I bring in the other one, which is going to have my environments or deployment list. Sorry. And then here, and then we just call this some deployment. Okay. So if I'm looking at this correctly, let me just do a new screen. And I'm a huge fan of using the form component. What is usually your technique here, Paulie, when you need to create a form against a data source?
Yeah, the form component, or I used to, when I first started using Power Apps, connect everything up to flows until I sort of understood the architecture a bit better. But exactly how you're doing it now is how I do it.
Gotcha. Yeah, so we usually have when people were first starting, and this was probably because of a lot of the training that was out and available, they would pull in these labels and text boxes and drop downs individually from the component gallery. And then they will wire them up so each one will represent a site column. And then they have these huge patch statements that creates the JSON object for each one of these pairs, and then submit that to the data source. And part of the justification of going through all of that work, which is painstaking, it was because they felt like they had more control over the layout, and this was too stringent of a layout. So like if they wanted to break this form up and add in like section headers or things along those lines, that would kind of force them to do everything manually, until they realized that in the form component, you can use custom data cards. And with the custom data cards, now you can put your rectangle and then your header text, really kind of break these up. It stays responsive. Even now with like responsive designs, you just have your custom layers here, and it just doesn't cost you a ton of time to get things going. And not only did that manual process take a lot of time to get set up, it was a pain in the butt to maintain.
Yeah, it
So if
really
they
is.
want if they want to add a simple column, right? You talk to the business user and they're saying, "Oh, I want to add this new field, put it above status." You're like repositioning everything. You're using your XY coordinates to get everything lined up. It's just it was sad to see. So anytime I do a training or anything like that, I'm pushing foreign component, foreign component, foreign component. You are not dropping these in individually.
I mean, something I still do on every app is have a screen where I have a sample of every type of control that I'm going to use. And then I set all the formatting on them there in this hidden screen. And then in my actual screens, I'm drawing the formatting from that hidden screen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've seen that technique.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it's best practice or if it's just something that a bunch of people do, but I find it can be quite helpful. Because if you want, it's sort of like cheap theming, you know?
Right, right. And I think those are the two. Like, I mean, if you and I'm gonna get back to the question here in a second, but if you look at this, I mean, what would you say is some of the key things that are missing? And I think you kind of touched on it. Like, it's cheap theming, right? There's no type of theme control. Ideally, you will want to set the theme here at the parent container that says, this is my default border, this is my default font size, this is my default font color, and everything, underneath that. The same, because they already have the architecture here, right? So if I click into this parent dot whatever, that's what all we need. Like give me those controls to set here, at the parent level, and then that just makes this that much more easier. So I think that's one. And then I think the ability of having some type of, and they have it here with components, right? Like you can make individual components with properties and things like that. I think that was definitely a step in the right direction. But outside of components, the one thing I think is sorely missing is some type of global functioning framework. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I mean, and that is on the way. There have been steps towards that. I mean, one of the things that I always think about whenever I'm building a Power App, and this is probably a strange thought, is sometimes when I use something like Bootstrap, which is the theming engine that Twitter created for browser-based products. Sometimes if you create a quick Bootstrap form, it just looks so good by default. And then I look at my Power App and I think, how can I make this Power App look less like a Power App,
Yeah.
And sometimes, like I did it last week, I sort of went down this rabbit hole. It was quite a simple app. Started replacing buttons for graphics, and I was actually in Canva designing little pieces for the screen. I just kind of wanted to get this more of a feel that's native for a user, because
Yeah.
Power Apps have got definitely a very Power Appy look, haven't they? They all
Yeah.
come out looking very similar.
Yeah.
And not there's anything wrong with the way they look. It's just, I don't know. I'm not always that crazy about it.
Yeah, no, and I think you're absolutely right. And even this, and I forgot about the theme generator, right? So
It's,
even if we can customize our own themes, the same way that we have with Fluent UI, right? And I think that's where they're going, because if you look at the Power App that's designed for Dynamics 365, or even the model-driven Power Apps, they have a slightly different theme than what we have here in the Canvas apps, right?
I haven't seen the Dynamics ones.
Yeah, so I think they're and I just read about the blog post on this, but there that has more of the Fluent UI components versus, and I'm not sure where these components came from. These are like Office components or something like that. But yeah, they apply the whole theme and component library to the Dynamics 365 Power Apps or the model driven Power Apps. right? The ones where you just point to, and then maybe a Dataverse or something like that. And based on that schema in Dataverse, it will automatically create the UI and the interfaces to add records and manipulate the records. But yeah, that has a much different theming capability than what we see here. Okay, so just to kind of round this off a little bit. So if we wanted to either set the default date from another data source, this is exactly where you would do it, right? So you would have to have some type of lookup or filter that says for this particular item in the main SharePoint list, this is the data I want to pull from this lookup SharePoint list. And from here, you just unlock it. So that way you can modify the data card. And then you will just simply do a lookup, right, versus a filter, because a lookup is going to give you a single record. So if you do a lookup and then you point to your data source, in our case, it's deployment. And I'm going to just arbitrarily say where title equals iteration 1. And then from there, I would just set that to the start date. And basically, that's all you need. So once you do that, then that's how you can have this date component pull information from another list in that manner. And this, depending on what your logic is here, for the most part, this is pretty scalable. I mean, you can use this all over the place. And these are tricks. This is the same technique that we use for cascading dropdowns or even manipulating dropdowns, right? And I think this is one of the things that Power Apps have compared to some of the legacy tooling that we're used to, like with InfoPath or Nintex Forms and things like that. Those are very prescriptive. These are just Lego blocks. So to Polly's point, based on your creativity and your understanding of the tooling and what you can and cannot do with data sources, and kind of bring everything together, this is, these types of techniques and these types of tricks are just things that you learned along the way. So Mohammed, hopefully that helps with that. So before I get into Diversity Love's other questions, or they do want to see I want to see your word template solution. So I don't know if you had anything prepared, Polly, or any demos you want to share.
Oh, let me just log into my flow. Let's have a look.
Okay.
I've got to start screen sharing in a minute. I just want to see what I got.
Sure, no problem.
I was messing around with it the other day, so God knows if it's in a working state, but it probably is. Fill Word document from Power Apps. Let's have a look. Yeah, go on, let's try it. I mean, I don't know if it works or not, but if it doesn't, it'll be fun to figure out why, won't it?
Sure, no problem.
Share screen. Okay, let me know when you can see.
Yes.
Okay, so actually, let me just close this. What I'm going to do is show you the app first, and then we'll have it execute the flow. I think there's probably a couple of items which are hidden on the app, which will help if we unhide. I know this was my sort of semi-finished version, so let's just play this and see if it works. There's a very simple, just 3 text boxes, or one text box, one date field, and then a signature field. I always like to set this pen input a bit fatter. So we'll just have it say demo. So hopefully that has run a flow. Let me just go and have a look at the run history here. Yeah, so that is running a flow now, fill Word document from Power Apps. So let's just go through it, go through the run history, and then see what it did. I'm just going to see if it actually did produce a document, because I didn't test this before we started. And it's in here, I think. Power Apps to Word demo, completed docs. There we go, a few seconds ago. And so this is the Word document that we just created. And for those that are watching that don't know, this has been created without any premium actions at all. So before we go into the depth of the flow, what I'm just going to quickly show you is, I think I'm sharing my window, not the entire screen. So I'm just going to share again, but I'm going to share the whole screen.
Okay.
Yep. So something that we were talking about at the beginning of this chat was that Word documents, and in fact all Word documents, are actually zip files. And this is the fundament to how this works. So if I create this new Word document and copy it and rename it to .zip, you will see that I can open this zip file up and go in here, and inside of this document.xml is really the core of the document itself. Now there is another folder which isn't here at the moment called media. So if I delete this and open up this again, and I go to insert, put a picture in, here's my signature box. So if I come out of here again, copy this, rename this to .zip, we will have a folder in here called media. And there is our image that I just inserted into there. And that image will be referenced by document.xml. So if I just get document.xml down here and search for the word test, because that's what I put in, here you can see the text that I actually entered into the document. This is a test. Now, if I put that into an XML beautifier, it would make a bit more sense. But how this flow works is I've created a template document. In fact, here it is on my screen, actually. This is my template document, and I have got a few fields. It says date 12345, name 12345, and I've got my signature box. The rest I'm just leaving alone. I've then unzipped that, and I have put it into a library in SharePoint called template, and that is just that Word document uploaded. So this is your template where you start from, and then I've got a folder called output where I'm just overwriting. This is my output folder. So my document.xml, you can see, was overwritten 4 minutes ago, and that's when we run that flow. And here is my two images. That one will be my header, and that one will be the signature that we just wrote.
So, Paulie, real quick. So, with these images, are these standard names? So, like if I have 5 images, regardless of their image original name, these would just be image 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 5.
Yeah, they keep going up. And where they are stored, if I go back into this, go back into Word, there is a folder called rels, and it has in here document.xml.rels, and I believe the reference is, go over to here and we'll say, I take that document.rels, you can see, I think, these are the relationships. Here we go. So we've got RID 1, 2, 6, 5, 4, and these relationships are, so maybe it's not in here. It has got something to do with that rels folder, but yeah, they all are just sequentially numbered, IMG1, IMG2, but they do keep their original format. So if you put in a JPEG, that won't be a PNG there.
Gotcha.
And so when I created this, I made sure that this was a PNG because a PNG is what is created from the Power App pen input.
Gotcha.
So this part is, I think, fairly simple. My submit button, all it does is run a flow and takes the text from the name, the date from the date picker, and then the pen input one.image with this include binary data flag on it. So let's go and have a look at the flow. And actually the flow turned out not that complicated. So I do a get file content on the original version of document.xml. Then we've got two really simple expressions. These could be in one expression, but for the sake of readability, they're in two. So I'm just replacing, you can see it here, name 12345, which we saw in the Word document, with the trigger input of name.
Got it.
Again, same thing with the date. Nothing clever going on there. That's using the output from replace name now, though, because that's replaced the name. Now we want to replace the date. So I'm replacing date 12345 with this second text value. Now things do get a little bit more interesting here. Let me just see how it works myself. Oh yeah, so this, when we get this from Power Apps, this is a data URI, not just base64. So if we look at the run history, the image looks like this: data colon image /PNG semicolon base64, and then we get to the base64 encode of the image. So if I took that and went into Notepad, that at the end, from there to there is my base64. If I went on the web and typed base64 image decoder, I should be able to put that in there, and then we get our
Beautiful.
image.
Awesome.
So that's what we want to get to in our flow, and we want to get rid of this data img base64. So I just took this string here, copied that. And all of this one is doing, this action is just getting rid of that first part. So it's just saying replace data img /PNG with nothing, all the way up to the comma. So if we look at that in Notepad, I actually deleted it. Everything from data to the comma. And that gives us our base64, which we can then use further down. So then I'm going to create a file, and I'm using the outputs from replace date. So we're recreating our document.xml. So that's our document.xml sorted, and that will take care of this date field and this customer field here, or whatever it was, this one here. And then we need to replace the image. So let's go back to the flow. So we can recreate the image file. I'm overwriting, I'm not deleting it first, I'm just overwriting the existing document, image2.png, with this base64 to binary expression, using the output from this compose action where I just snipped out that bit of data that we didn't need. And that will recreate the image. Now, this final bit, and this is what we were discussing very early in the conversation, this is a scope called create zip, and this is what enables the whole thing to work, really. I've got a separate video on this because you might be wanting to create a zip for something other than creating Office documents. And what this will do is take this entire folder of this output, and it's going to zip the whole thing up. Now, effectively, this is the same as clicking on this and then clicking download. If I download that zip file, which is just now downloaded, and I'll grab that, cut it. If I paste that onto my desktop, I don't know if this will work, I haven't actually tried it myself, rename that to docx, it works. So you can see that even when we're just zipping up the raw files from SharePoint, we can open them as a Word document.
Gotcha.
I'm quite relieved that worked actually, because I had no idea if it would. And I learned something at the same time. So that second part of the flow, it really is just simulating this zip action. So I will quickly go through it, but you don't have to make this. You can just copy this whole part off my blog and just paste it into your flow. And that being able to copy and paste scopes is quite a powerful function actually.
I learned that from you. I didn't realize. I always saw the copy from clipboard option, but I
Yeah.
never knew that you can just copy different segments. That's pretty impressive.
So we have some settings at the top, and then we send a HTTP action to SharePoint. And here we can see this secret little action, render list as data stream. In fact, I'll show you that in the browser in a minute because it is interesting. And if you look at the documentation for this render list as data stream, lots of good stuff you can do with it.
Wow.
So there's a couple of encode commands. We want to encode our library path and our root folder. The root folder is the folder within the document library where we want to zip. And then we get this parameters bit here. This is actually really interesting. These numbers here represent what you want render list as data stream to give you back. Now, this produces a hell of a lot of information in its response, and you can use it to do all kinds of things. And these numbers represent what kind of information you want back from that list. It's worth just having a quick look at the output of that. Even though it's huge, let's have a quick look. I'm just going to put it into Notepad so we can see it. What we get is, here's our standard array of row data. This is where our data begins. Now, if you look a bit further down, you can start to see, and I'm not sure if I did it on this one. No, but right at the bottom of the list, we'll have some interesting things. This stuff down here is interesting if someone feels like doing an interesting blog post. I'd never heard of this before, this WOPI. And WOPI is it's a protocol for integrating Office with the web. But this is an API in itself and a standard, and you can begin to use this to exploit other abilities. It's something I'm going to look at even more, but I haven't done so yet. But there's hidden secrets in here, everyone. So, okay, here we go. Here's the stuff I was talking about. So when you render this list as a data stream, you get a whole bunch of other information. Drive access token, drive URL, media base URL. And you can see here, for me, this is UK West 1. And this is this media service where you can do transformations, thumbnails, video conversions, PDF conversions. There's all kinds of stuff in here. And you just take these bits in between the curly braces and replace them with the values from above.
Gotcha.
So let's go back to our flow, which I was over here with it. So we do our SharePoint HTTP action. We extract the access token from there. And then we need to do a select to get everything in shape for how the zip API is expecting it. And if we look at the run history, I'll just flip back to the run history here. We've got a nice, this is our sort of inbound array, which is huge. And our action, the output of our select is quite nice and small. There's our folder, rels, and that is a folder. You can see is folder is true. Most of these are folders, but I think there's a content types.xml is not a folder. So we just send that all as one. Let's go back to here. This just wraps the output of select in another object called items. and then we do another send a HTTP request to SharePoint. And here you can see what I'm sending is the site address is that media base URL, which we just saw over here somewhere. I'll just search for it. Media base, there it is there. Media base URL, and it'll be here a few times. That is where this action is going to.
Got it.
Posting it there. This CS, I just learned what this was the other day and I've already forgotten. Caller stack. I don't know what it means, but you need it. And then you can put anything in for the zip file name because we're just getting back base64 anyway. And this is interesting. You can see it says provider equals SPO as SharePoint Online. I believe, haven't tried it yet, you could also do this with OneDrive for Business because it's effectively the same really. And then it just encodes, URI encodes the output of this attachment items. So then I'll create a Word document. Is literally just taking the output that we get back from SharePoint and calling it docx. Just like I took that zip folder and it was called .zip and renamed it to docx, we're taking a zip and naming it docx. And then we're just saving the base64 that we get back to binary and downloading it. It's probably easier to see on the run history. There we go. It went to this media server address. This was the caller stack, whatever that means. And then we can see the body here, not particularly easy to read because it's been URL encoded. You can just about make some of it out. Is folder equals true. And the output will be base64, which is $content. So we still get our headers, and then we go straight into base64. And we could put that into any base64 decoder, and what we would get back would be a zip file. Then we just save it. So now that I've sort of gone through it again, it does actually seem simple, but it took me a long time to kind of figure out it was this creation of the zip that was the stumbling block. But when you see it like that, it does seem quite simple. Not simple as a built-in action, but simple enough to work with, I think.
But that's what I was going to get to, because I think when you look at these, so what you have is almost an engine, right? And you know where all the parameters are that's going to make that unique for your different scenarios. So what if you take what you've built and create a custom connector so now everyone in the organization can use it, right?
Yeah.
And then just treat it like an encapsulated function, pass in the needed information that's needed, and rebuild it. Because I know for a fact, like even myself, I would be, if I needed that solution in several Power Automates, I will copy it, and then if something happens, now I'm trying to figure out like how do you support it, like how do you scale it if you have multiple copies around.
Well, I mean, if it was in a solution, you could create it as a child flow. But the other way that I do what you're talking about often is change the trigger to when a HTTP request is received. So we're taking our parameters from another flow, from receiving a HTTP request, and then pass the binary back, or the base64 back. So all that you'll be supplying is a few parameters, and what you'll be getting back is your base64. You might not even send the data back. You might just write the file out and then send back the file name and the path, so that your calling flow or your calling process will know where to go and pick that file up.
That's very smart. Because with the child, because when you mentioned child flow, I looked into that, but I think they changed. I don't know if that was a recent change, but one of the barriers I had to run into was that your solution had to be a solution in order to use a child flow. So I love the HTTP request scenario. Now, when you call those, do you have to send a access token to fire it, or is that an anonymous request?
No, it's anonymous. So we could just save this again now. And we could call it, let's try it. Call it HTTP word creation. And then go back to here. This would be quite fun to try out, actually. So we'll get rid of that trigger. We'll say when a HTTP request, and you know I love, this is my favorite action trigger when a HTTP request has been received. And then we will we'll create a bit of JSON quickly. We're going to use as our, let's say, name 8. No, we'll say sig. I don't know how we're going to generate the signature at the moment.
Okay.
We'll come to that. We'll generate the schema like that. And then we've got something that can be triggered via HTTP. Now, if we were doing it via Power Apps and then another flow that was doing it, that would be simple. So, do you know what I'm going to do is, that's fine. And then we'll do a response. And then we'll say name, dynamic content somewhere. Yeah, in our create Word doc. Yeah, so we should have the file name from create Word doc. And we'll we'll just send the ID back, because we'll know the other properties.
Right.
So now we could go and create a new flow. We've got our new URL. New flow, instant cloud flow. Go back and now switch this flow on. Send the HTTP request, and it will be a, let's just edit this, because we're going to post some data to it. Show advanced options, method, post. Let's save that. Then we're going to do a post here. This is going to be our URI. In the body, I'll just use the example I created over here. Then actually what we'll do is we'll do base64 image decoder, encoder I want. Oh, that's a bit disappointing. This one will do.
During the weekend maintenance.
Yeah, let's open this up and make an edit to it. I'm just going to open up this, and I'll get, I'm not good with these tools, so I'm just going to get a pen and do some scribbles on it. Save that. Okay. And we'll get our sig box, drop that on there. Okay, so we got our base64. So I'll put that in there. And that is going to be our body. Then we'll do a compose here, show the output of our HTTP action. Now, I don't know what this is going to do, but let's go back to our SharePoint list. And then documents, Power Apps to Word, completed documents. So we've got 3 documents there. Let's just delete them all so that we know if it's worked or not.
Okay.
And go back over to here. All right, let's just run this now and see what happens. So it's not looking good, is it? Let's go and have a look. HTTP word create. Okay, so this now is stuck in a retry loop.
Oh,
I actually hate that
okay.
as a default, so I'm going to cancel that. And I'm just going to edit this flow here. I'm going to say settings, retry policy, none, because I want to know if it's failing while I'm testing it.
Right.
I don't want it to keep retrying on my behalf. And then this one failed a bunch of times over. Oh, okay, because I didn't pass the JSON. It doesn't know what I'm talking about here. So what I'm going to do is edit this. Now the parse JSON step. But you know what? We don't need to do that. We can just replace name. It will know it. Instead of trigger body text, it's going to be name. The date is going to be date dynamic content. And at base 64, we don't actually need to replace this anymore, but I would do it anyway. It's this trigger body. We don't need that actually. We can just do replace. And we should have down here an image. And I called it SIG. So let's save that. And that was a fair enough failure. So we'll try with this test failed 1 minute ago.
Oh, we didn't pass it the binary, did we?
Base 64 to IMG base 64. I think that should have worked. Let's have a look. Obviously it didn't work, but I don't actually know why. Base 64 to binary. So it wasn't happy with my base 64 for some reason. Which I thought it would have been. Let me just go back and have a look at the run history one more time to see what came in. That is base 64. That looks like base 64 to me. Create file, create image file. Base 64 binary. Value cannot be decoded from a base 64 representation. Let's just have a quick look at that. It's IMG base 64. Okay, I'm not going to figure that out now because it'd be boring for everybody. So I'm just going to say configure run after has failed, just to see where else we get to. I think it's probably just going to fail further down the line now, but do you know, I always do that on that interface when I press test and I forget to go to the previous.
Right. I love that feature. It saves you a lot of retesting options. I wonder if you probably have a space in there somewhere.
Yeah, I thought it was a space. I did think it was a space, and there it is, just been created. So we've just created that with the output. The image isn't going to work, but I forgot what I put in as my pull in the 1st of the 1st 2021, and that came through. So you could you could drive it via another flow. We could even drive it via a web form that submits to here and then generates a document straight back from it. So there's loads of different possibilities. And something I was playing with yesterday was doing exactly the same technique on PowerPoint slides. PowerPoint slides are actually a bit easier because, do you know what? I cleared up my desktop before we started, and now I need what was on there. PowerPoint slides are all stored inside of, the content is stored in each separate slide. So let's go new blank. Okay, so if we close that up, I'll copy it here. I was just playing with creating dynamic, actually a bit easier to create sort of visually pleasing documents like certificates and stuff like that within PowerPoint. So if we go into here, there's slides. You can see slide1.xml is the one that we just created. If I get that open, and then we should be able to see in here. It's actually a bit easier to work with to replace these values because Word does a lot of like grammar and spelling checking, whereas PowerPoint doesn't. And so, for example, in Word, that word would be split into three. It would be the capital D, the lowercase e, the uppercase S would be on its own, and then it would be HON. Whereas in PowerPoint, you can just look for the value.
Gotcha.
You can make Word behave like this, but I did cover that in the video demo I did actually. But when you look at it in this view, you realize that a Word document and a PowerPoint document, they're almost actually the same thing. But it is nice that you can do it per slide, because a Word document gets very complicated if it's a big document, and it becomes quite hard to manipulate, whereas the slides tend to be a bit easier to work with. So was that I can't see the chat, so was that a satisfactory demo and explanation of how it worked?
Yeah, so we're pretty quiet in the chat. Usually, what we find out on these Saturday sessions, people drop in and then they have to leave because personal obligations, but they tend to watch the recordings afterwards and leave a lot of comments in the video. So yeah, we'll be monitoring those. One of the things that came up, and I know we have to wrap because we only have 4 minutes left. Is the dynamic table in a Word document, right?
Yeah.
So would that be very similar to where, you're sniffing out the XML and the document XML, finding where the repeat table is, and you're just, I guess, doing a entire replace on that?
Well, this is the thing that everyone wants, and it's actually the thing that led me to start looking at PowerPoint, because it's actually a bit easier to do in PowerPoint. I was generating repeating tables in PowerPoint the other day. Now it's possible to do it with Word. It's just XML at the end of the day, but it's not like I was trying to build a simple flow that I could share with people that did it, and it isn't so simple, to be honest. It's a shame that there's a Power Automate expression called XML path. I don't know if you've used that. Super powerful. It's one of the most powerful things in Power Automate. And there's also the XML function. Now, in theory, using the XML and XPath functionality, we should be able to combine those to create a repeating table on our behalf. But it's just not quite there, so we have to do it by hand, and that gets quite complicated quite quickly, especially if you want to put images into it. If you don't want to put images, no big deal. Actually, I'll probably do a video on it. But if you want to put repeating images that are different in every row, then it gets complicated quite quickly, because you have to make a relationship in that relationships file, add an image, and then put it into the document.
I mean, at what point do you just go with the premium connector? Because even in some of the steps that you showed, like the HTTP request, I mean, that's a premium connector. So at what point do you just say, you know what, let's just do the premium connector? And I've done the exact same thing with the PMP provisioning engine, right? So I went down the path of creating an Azure function that was an API function, then you just trigger the request and then you get a response back. And I love that because I have full control of how to do the provisioning and save the XML for the site templates and all the other stuff. But then I found PlumSale, and I looked at the licensing. I was like, dude, $30 a month. You can trigger this 500 times a month. Let's just do PlumSale. And it's not a custom solution that I would have to babysit. and it's a connector, so any other app maker within the organization can kind of leverage it. So when I started to see that we're jumping through so many hoops, we're definitely learning a lot along the way. Like now we have a solution to create zip files, or now we have a way to crack open a Office document using zip, and do your example showing a way how you replace the images and things along those lines. But I'm just thinking, like, at what point do you just say, do a premium connection connector, but design it in a way to where you're not paying premium for every user of the application?
Yeah, yeah, and I think you're right. So, if it's triggered by an entry being created in Dataverse or SharePoint, and then another account picks it up, does the work, whatever it needs to do, and then writes it back, that's fine. It's if you've got a situation where you're suddenly going to need to have 400 people licensed, then it becomes a problem, and you can't just share a flow between 400 people, but which you can if it's a non-premium. So I think it just depends on the requirements. I like it's easy for me because I generally have control over the environments and I can use premium connectors. But I know just from chatting to people on the forums that there's a demand to do it without a premium connector, which is why I did. In fact, I did it because you asked me to, but I was halfway there anyway. But
Yeah,
you gave me the final motivation.
that's awesome. All
So
right.
yeah, I
Well,
think you're right. Sometimes premium is the right thing to do, and sometimes it's the only way.
yeah. Have you created a custom connector yet?
Yeah, and it's a process that can be quite frustrating at times, I found. You?
I have played around with it. I just used a general API. I think it was like a sample API or free API or something like that. Ran it through Postman, got my Swagger, and then just dropped it in, and then just start using it that way. Nothing complex in the sense that Azure Function hosted in Azure, right? And then
Oh
using
yeah.
the Azure API to make sure the user's authenticated and in some case authorized, right? So those ones I haven't created, but from an enterprise, that can be a wonderful integration story, right? In the sense that we already have these custom services or even microservices created within the org. How do we present these in a way to the Power Platform? And then using that connection or connector framework, because not only can you authorize who have access to use it, but you can also scale it to say these are only available in this environment and not maybe have it in the default environment. So you get a little bit more control over it as well.
So the good thing with custom connectors is there is a new. So I attend these Power Platform super user group meetings that we have with Microsoft, and they've created a new custom connector development group on the Power Automate or Power Platform forums, which is Microsoft are in that forum themselves. So if you're having trouble building a custom connector, they might help you out. They do work in that forum. I have created custom connectors to both QuickBooks and Xero, and there is now also a custom connector public library where you can begin to publish your custom connectors, and they'll import directly into your Power Platform environment. One of the biggest problems I've had is that typically speaking, when you want to create a connector, you would start off the work in Postman, just as you did. But Power Platform doesn't support doesn't support the format that Postman now exports. And
Exactly.
I did ask one of the guys from Microsoft about that, and they're aware. They didn't give any timeline as to when that would be addressed, but it is a bit of a frustration.
So I had to use, and I ran into the exact same thing. So I guess there's two Postman apps. So the one that I have was from the App Store, the Microsoft Store, and that one still has the old schema that you can use versus the desktop one that you download from the browser. So that may be an option as well.
So
And
the
I'm not
desktop
sure.
one, so I've got both. In the desktop one, I deliberately got an old version installed, and
Gotcha.
I went to find what the latest version was that still had the old functionality, if you know what I mean. So if
Right.
anybody else wants to know, my version is, hang on, doesn't actually say when it starts up, and there's no about. General details. I don't know, but my version, I think it was version 6 point something.
Okay.
I'm surprised I can't easily see it. I'm looking for it on the screen, but
So you have a desktop. So you were able to find an older desktop version, download that, and then that gave you the older schema.
yeah, I got it now. So I've got version 6.7.4, which is quite old,
6.7. Okay.
but it's nice to have. I like to have the desktop app, which I can then use to talk to other apps. Because yeah, as I say, I was developing connectors to Xero and to QuickBooks.
Gotcha.
So the custom connector functionality is powerful, and
I
it,
think
and it
so.
unlocks a whole new world for you as well. You know.
It does. It does. And I think it puts that's one of the biggest questions that we have. And then hopefully I can have someone on in the next couple of weeks from recruiting to kind of help with what they're seeing in the marketplace for those who are really interested, either doing full-time jobs or freelance consultants or even working for a consulting firm. And what are they looking for from a skill set? Because right now there's this huge transition from what used to be a SharePoint developer and what is the skill that's needed for you to provide services now, understanding that custom SharePoint development, what we were used to, is really start to dissolve. Right, there's not that many, like, with SharePoint on-prem, we used to always create custom web parts or custom themes or custom master pages in order just to make SharePoint useful in the classic versions of SharePoint. But now with the modern versions of SharePoint, a lot of the customization is starting to go away because you get a lot of functionality, configurable functionality out of the box. The UI and the theming is responsive and works very well with both desktop and mobile and all the devices in between. So now the question is, what is a SharePoint developer in this modern world, in this cloud first, mobile first, Microsoft cloud platform world? And I think it's just that, right? It's either you're working, and that's why I love your demos, man, because you can tell that what you're doing is not a power user technique. That's a pro user technique, a pro dev technique. But you want to be like, okay, now if I have my dev shop, I don't want to spend, my dev resources on creating something that my power users, but instead, I would rather have them focused on building APIs, building custom connectors that would further enable my app makers or citizen developers within the organization to leverage these in a controlled and safe way, like especially with your QuickBooks and your Xero integration. I mean, that's controlled and you're monitoring that, and I'm sure you're going to authorize and things like that. But you can do that in a safe way to where the developers are not the bottleneck, because that's the issue that we have now. Like pro devs, the bottleneck. That's why citizen developers and all that stuff has that promise of allowing organizations to move faster. And then two, you're still enabling those app developers and citizen developers to take advantage of it. So I think those are going to be interesting, because I think everything that you talked about today, like even the HTTP request to fire off a flow, I have a pro dev creating that flow, creating that complex piece, and then just making it available to my app makers using that URL and then telling them which parameters. And I'm creating custom connectors for these integrations. Like even though like the on-prem integration is probably the most common scenario. I have this line of business app that I can use to connect when SharePoint was on-prem. Now that it's in the cloud, how do I fuse them together? So the custom connector with the gateway built by a pro dev, exposing what the pieces that you want to expose, has a much better story.
Yeah, I mean I was never a SharePoint developer, and I've come to SharePoint as an Office 365 user, really. So I never was really that involved with the old SharePoint versions, but you can see that was a much bigger business than it is now. One of the things I love about SharePoint is that custom JSON list formatting. Some people are doing absolutely brilliant things with that. And, there are times when if you can get that list formatting right, you don't even need an app. You can do a lot with that. There's a guy on Twitter that I follow who does absolutely brilliant things with JSON list formatting.
Yes, yes, and I think that's one of those scenarios, and I love that as well because when you look at all of these solutions, one of the things that lists and libraries bring to the table is that that's your data view, right? And it's customizable, so you can have multiple views, right? And you can have that interaction, and that's just the UI. That's just a whole collection of screens that you just don't have to worry about. And then if you can back into that security model to where you're controlling read, write access and then admin access and all the other fun stuff, you just get a lot for free, and you can really just focus on the solution. So I really love that. That's one of the things that I want to personally jump more into, just to understand that the different pros and cons with the different solutions. But to your point, when triggering a Power Automate, I think having like a custom list row or even a custom column to where you can represent, like, generate PDF or generate Word document, whatever, and have that as a button versus the Power Automate when item is selected. That whole, because that's kind of kludgy, right? Because first time run, you have to accept the connectors and the
Yeah.
data sources. Whereas if you can just click a button, it go off and does this thing, and then you get an update or email when it's done. I think that's just a much better experience, and I can see where those JSON formatting can really come in and help out in those scenarios as well.
Good.
All
Well,
right.
thank you for having me.
No, thank you. I really do appreciate it. Yeah, thank you so much. And again, it was great meeting you. A huge fan of your work. I will share out, the link to your YouTube channel and all this other fun stuff. But outside of that, man, have a great weekend, and thank you again for joining the call.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for all of your efforts. It's a great channel, and best of luck going forward.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Paulie.
Cheers. Bye
Take
bye.
care of yourself. All right, so that was our session for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you so much for the questions and the interaction and the engagement. You guys have a wonderful weekend. Again, I don't have, I will be posting in the chat at the end of the session. If there's any questions that you want, we are cataloging all these issues and solution ideas and trying to crank these out as we have time to interact with them. But again, thank you so much for your time. Any questions, leave it in the comment section or fill out the form once we post a link. Until then, take care of yourself, and we'll chat soon.